Hi. Nice to see you, Dana.
It's me.
Um, yeah, super cool. So I don't know, Dana. You just reached out to me out of the blue. I don't know what to expect, and I don't know what we're going to talk about today. But um, maybe maybe we could just chat about maybe talk about your what you're doing, and then we could just go from there.
Okay. So,
Cool.
so I do human genome research. I'm a computational biologist, and I work independently as a research scholar. I'm part of an institute. I don't know if I should say the name of the institute here or not because it's going to
Oh,
be.
I think no, I think that's wonderful. I was looking it up and it's very unusual, but I think also pretty cool.
Yeah.
I actually watched the followers or the founders video and I was very impressed with it.
Okay. I'm glad you did that. So,
Yeah.
the institute runs on a very different model to traditional academia. And we can talk about that. But at this point in my career, I am thinking to move into the more traditional setting.
Oh,
Uh,
okay. So sorry, what's the institution name again so everybody knows?
it's the Ronin Institute.
Okay.
Okay. So before we say anything else, I just really want to thank you for making the videos that you make because you're just so open and honest about things. And I think it's so helpful to other people. It's been helpful for me to watch the videos, but also, it's going to help other people to make decisions, to make good decisions. And also, I think just, the wider audience, people outside of academia, to really understand what is happening, within academia. It's so important. So thank you for that. Just, yeah.
I do appreciate that. It definitely is. It's not always easy to be open. So thank you.
Yeah. So, back to the institute. The Ronin Institute operates a very different model of academia. Um, in traditional academia, things are very hierarchical. So typically, as you know, you would have a PI, a principal investigator leading a lab, and beneath them in the hierarchical structure, you have students, postdocs, possibly other people working for that group leader. In the Ronin Institute, there is no hierarchy of that kind. And I find that to be something that's very positive. Each researcher is an individual who does their research, and the lab, so to speak, the group, is groups that we form, collaborators form either within the institute or reaching out outside of the institute. And it creates a very different type of dynamic. So that's one thing. The other thing is that it's global and distributed. So people are sitting in different countries. It is US based, but people are in different locations and are able to carry out their research um, from wherever they are, using all kinds of tools that are very advanced, as we know, right? The platforms at this point in time are very amenable to that. And so that's another aspect of the Institute. Yeah.
Okay, so why did you choose to do this? That's such a non-typical career path to do something like that, rather than being associated with what I call highfalutin university.
So I was educated at very typical traditional institutes in the UK. Institutions in the UK. I do have a PhD and postdoctoral experience, but I'm an atypical person. So I wanted to be in a different situation to the typical traditional model. I didn't want to continue postdocing. I also am my personality type is that I have other interests. So just right off the bat, I'll tell you, I'm a wellness practitioner. I practice meditation and hypnosis with clients and with groups of people. So I don't only do academic research, I do both. And a traditional university would be unlikely to accept that or permit that.
Hmm.
Even if I could do it in my spare time in the weekend, which I could do mostly academia, have a full-time academic job and do this on the side, but it would be frowned upon. I feel that's how I feel, because you have to be 100% unilaterally focused and dedicated, supposedly. But actually, I feel that's very narrow in scope.
Hmm.
Other things that I do open me up to new types of research, to different ways of thinking. And that's part of, you know, who I am. So,
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I also think that that is such a, I mean, the world's evolving, right? And people are doing all sorts of really interesting things today, not just their, I mean, every time I drive in an Uber, I meet somebody that was, maybe they were, so, sometimes they're like executives, sometimes they're moms, and they're just driving. Sometimes they're full-time Uber drivers, but a lot of times they're not. And I think we sort of need to address that humans have all of these kind of weird and crazy, interesting interests. So I actually kind of appreciate it. But those two interests are, um, how do I say, diametrically opposed. You're a very hardcore mathematician, and then you're doing something that is less so. Tell me about what happened. Why did you pursue these two interests?
well, I'll explain. Actually, my background is in the life sciences. The core of my interests are human health and wellness, you see. So I'm a computational biologist. I do human genome research. It's true that I will publish, in sort of mathsy types of things, but the core of what I do is really, um, human health and wellness is a big part of it. And so actually, the research itself, the research interest, and my other interests are more synergistic than they may seem. Okay.
Yeah, I completely I get it. Have you ever been inspired from one, say from the wellness side, with your research? Like, has that driven anything where you've all of a sudden gotten a eureka moment?
Yes. The So for example, I mean, I don't know exactly what you're asking, but the meditation practice is a very powerful practice. I not only do this with clients, I also do it for myself. So it does create a new type of focus, an ability to, to have inspiration. But in terms of research itself, I have had inspiration to carry out research which is slightly different, let's say, than the conventional, because of the wellness practice. And just one other thing as well is that I find that, in my practice as well, I tend to attract academics, and some of them are medical practitioners, medics, and doctors, nurses, various people in the medical professions who also do research, and they seem to understand what I do. Yeah, it's much easier for them, and they also relate to it. They say, yes, I'm a practicing medic and I'm also a researcher, and I understand what you're doing.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So does it keep you grounded more? Is that what you're suggesting, or what's the value added of doing uh, meditation or some sort of practice when you're in such a it, so being an academic or being a researcher is such a strange career because it doesn't seem like it's stressful from the outside, but it really truly is, right? We're sitting there on a couch thinking, but then we're also competing. So
Right.
how does it keep you focused and
I mean,
grounded?
personal practice, the meditation.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I do
Hmm.
meditate every day, and the practice is very powerful. Even focusing on breathing alone, even that on its own, without going deeper into a deeper type of practice, is extremely grounding. And I mean, it does release stress, and it creates a greater ability to focus and be balanced and be, yeah, there's no question about it that meditation is, I mean, we know this from the ancient traditions and ancient teachings, that meditation is extremely powerful in various ways. But even at the moment, this is being studied scientifically as well, which is interesting.
Hmm.
And the indications are that it does release stress, and um, there are all kinds of impacts to meditation.
So then, how did you get into becoming an academic? Is this something that's in your family or, doing not academic in the sense of the traditional way, but thinking about doing research? Is this in your family? Was this something that, you just kind of stumbled into?
I think the way I'm thinking back now to the way that it happened. I was an undergraduate student. I did a project. I did a research project.
And where was this?
This was in London, in one of the London universities,
Okay.
and I was very good at it. And so I guess I was a good student. I did well in the research, and then I went on. It continued from there. The opportunities just seemed to present themselves and unfold, and it did make sense. I do have an aptitude for it, and a very strong interest in the biological sciences. I started in biochemistry, and went on to bioinformatics. My PhD was in bioinformatics and computational biology, and I
Hmm.
also have experience with structural biology. These are things that I have a very natural aptitude and interest for. I'm also a researcher, educator type. It's just part of who I am, I guess.
Hmm.
Now, whether or not um, the traditional setting is right for me or I'm right for it, that's a separate question, right? um, but that's my nature, that's my aptitude, my inclination is to go towards that, and yeah, that unfolded very naturally for me early on.
And then you did postdocs after, you said?
I did, yes,
Okay.
but
Okay. So
relatively
several.
short as well, because they're just, one postdoc in particular would have been excellent to continue, but the funding ran out. There just
Yeah.
always seem to be funding issues, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. Is that and I know in the UK actually a PhD is traditionally shorter, right? It's 3 years.
Mine took 5 years, so
5 years.
it
Okay.
can be
So
quite.
yeah, yeah, mine was similar. It was 5 years as well. And then I did a postdoc after it, which was kind of like just me trying to get enough publications or, on track to get a job. It's
Right.
essentially what it is, right? Um,
So yeah, so going back to your early career, when you were a graduate student, what were your hopes and dreams at that point? Why did you engage in research?
oh my gosh. I think I was enticed with ideas. they just seemed very cool, that there was all these wonderful ideas that were out. And I know that seems like really abstract to talk about that, but
No, it
it was
isn't.
just,
It totally makes
yeah,
sense. Yeah.
yeah. And I was very practical in the sense of what I chose to do. I'm very like logical in the sense of, going to university in of itself was such a strange thing to my family because I'm the only one out of, I mean, anybody, and my family's big, that went away. Um, and and then so I always was very practical. So I chose engineering. Always sort of thinking about a career. That was my undergrad. And then it was like, okay, what is the next? I love ideas, but I also want to make sure that I can find a job at the end of it. And you know, realistically, I actually thought I would become a consultant after I did this. So then I was like, okay, well then I'll go get a PhD in business because that seems like it would be, a lucrative career choice, but also be able to do research and development. So I actually, in the moment, there's kind of a defining moment. The guy doesn't even know, and you probably will never run into him again. But I was a roommate with um, somebody in Calgary, Alberta, that had their PhD in the same thing as you, medical informatics. I'm sorry, I just have this weird shadow that's going on, so I'm trying to figure. I did my. I was working because of the program I was at. They did. Um, they called them co-op um, work terms, but it was like internship. So I had a roommate for a summer that was a PhD in biomedical informatics. I thought that would be really cool, and he was kind of working for a hospital. That sounds really cool. He's like 20 years old. Um, and then, I just had my sights on that after, and I wanted to be very practical. And I was always enticed with ideas, like really, really enticed with them, that it just opens up such a world that I didn't know existed before. And um, then it was after that, it was kind of like logical. I was like, okay, all I need to do is get a PhD. My life will be all done, and it'll be really easy after that, right? But you just kind of check box these things, and ultimately, it didn't, wasn't like that. And in a lot of what I do, and what I'm open about is grappling with reconciling, feeling that I've got this like laid out plan that seems all rational, and then reconciling with what life actually looks like. And life does not put you in that sort of straight path that's laid out, and that there's all these weaving paths. I mean, I tried to work with some of the best people, and it just took longer. It was a hard problem that I was working on. My dissertation was like 350 pages. It just took longer, and then then I had to sort of figure out a way to publish this, and I'm still working on papers 12 years later from that research. It just is like, how do I reconcile this inconsistency of like, this is a step-by-step process, but then the research itself, or I would say life, does not fold out in a quick and easy way
Right.
that you have in your mind. And part of what I tried to do is reconcile it publicly, of let's just be patient, let's slow down. um, we will maybe get there eventually, but that's the hope, but maybe you don't get there, and then you sort of have to reconcile, what does that mean for you to have your feel like you should have all of these things laid out, and I feel like I should be um, highly successful now and all of those those
Okay, here's the
things.
thing though. I have to a little bit interrupt you because to an outsider, somebody who is outside of academia, they're going to look at you and even within academia and say, well, wait a minute, this guy is successful, right? You're a professor, an associate, is that right? An associate professor at a
Yeah.
major US university, right? And you have a PhD, you went through postdocing, you went up and up, right? Again, it's a system, right? And you're an associate professor, and that's a great achievement. And I think just to non-academics, some of your videos, which by the way, I understand it, but to them, they'll look at it and say, this guy feels like he isn't good enough or isn't enough. What is this? It's shocking, right? Please, yeah, expand on.
Oh gosh. That's very difficult um, to explain. I think to me, I finally sort of reconciled what I think what was driving that, and is still today, is that I was, you know, ultimately in some formative periods of my life, I was a very lonely person. And that was like when I was 13, 14 years old, and I felt like there was nobody around, and for various different reasons, I really didn't have a lot of friends. And so then my way to show to the outside world was like, okay, if I am the best possible version of me, then I can be then the outside world would understand that, that, hey, everybody would like me. And I know that sounds really stupid,
No, it's
but I've come to terms with like that is such a driving force
right. It's
with
kind of
who.
having to perform in a way, having to maybe overperform. Yeah. But
Yeah.
there's something else in the message that you send in your videos, which is there is a very real environment and system around you, which does put a pressure on you. That's the impression I get. Please describe the types of pressures, the very real pressures that you're under in your actual position.
Oh my gosh. That's a very good question. I think so. There's an infrastructure. I think how people traditionally think about science is they're thinking about the scientific method. And they're thinking of two ways of thinking about it. One of them is a collection of body of literature and sort of information. And then on the other side, they're thinking about how they're doing the scientific method, where you're simply like executing on a hypothesis, and you're sort of dreaming up these hypotheses from what people have done before, and then you go and test them, and then you tell people. That is a very, very idealistic and far from the truth perspective. What it actually is it's an institution, it's a set of rules and norms to make us want to um, work more, and comply with producing information, or to produce as much information as possible.
Yeah, I get
And
you're a content
it's
producer in a way. There's a real pressure to produce that content.
yeah, it's really strange, right? Like, what is I don't
Really?
know. Um, and there's this urgency to get there sooner, to demonstrate. So there's amazing. So I don't know if you've seen the Beautiful Mind.
Yeah, I'm familiar with it.
Okay. So it's a story of John Nash, this mathematician, and there's a scene in A Beautiful Mind, and it sort of plays in my head all the time. The whole movie is him grappling with schizophrenia, but it's also grappling with the academic game, where people feel like they don't fit in. And there's a moment where he's walking through, I think it's like Yale or Princeton. I think it's Princeton. And he's walking through and people are pointing at him because he doesn't feel like he fits in. And and then at the very end of the movie, he sits down in this big cafeteria hall and all of these professors come over and they do this ritual where they give a pen to him and point in his direction as a form of respect. Um, and the movie captures what it means to do research very well. It's vivid in my mind of that you are trying to impress upon these very doubting, skeptical individuals that feel um, that ultimately I think are they're just discounting, right? And you realize that, and I talk about this a lot, is that people are just self-interested, right? They're thinking about themselves and how successful that they are, and there is like not an there's it's not so there's a difference between a family and what you do in academia. In academia, in family, there's unconditional love where no matter what you do, you are considered part of us. And I think a lot of firms or lots of companies are on 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 that side where you feel a little bit more like a family, where you are part of something. In academic research, you feel that there's conditional love, that you are only given respect if you perform. And the only way that you can achieve that respect is by demonstrating to others that you somehow are successful.
Right.
Um, and it's such a challenging thing to reconcile. Where and I'm talking too much, I guess I
No,
feel, but
it's
yeah.
good, it's good. So there's also a sense of urgency about it. In other words, it's almost as if to really achieve something meaningful can take time, but there is this sense of looming something. There's an urgency, a pressure, and and what comes to mind when you're talking is the publish or perish idea. Yeah.
Mhm.
Um, do you feel that sense of pressure?
So I say yes, absolutely. I think there is an expediency that is not good for the scientific effort. The expediency is that you need to do everything in a hurried way. And why it's not good is that there's pressure to do all of these sort of shortcuts. And I think that there actually is. I think that there's a bit of a house of cards that is going on, that there is a lot of very fine, thin findings that we have. And perhaps I do that as well because of expediency. I try to get things done um, that are not as robust and valid as we would like, because we're hurrying to publish. To If we don't publish, if we don't have something, we cannot get a job. It's just not possible.
Exactly.
Um, and it's not only that you can't get a job, you have no mobility anywhere in the career.
And the
Um,
academy that you're in as well presents a timeline that is potentially quite intense and pressurized as well, right?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And this is why I try to be very, I think breaking free from these norms or breaking free from feeling this expediency by reframing the problem and saying, hey, you have opportunities all over the place. And you're extremely talented individuals. By breaking that sort of tunnel vision that we have, for me, it's a little bit more freeing to know that. And I was like, had this amazing privilege the other day. I talked to Brian Nozick, who is an luminary in psychology at this moment, where he basically showed, or that his massive team showed, but he was one of the leads, showed that some science is not necessarily as valid and reliable as we would like. But it's not like it's not throwing everything out, but he showed that is not as valid as we would like. But I think a part of that is because we have this expediency feeling to do things as quickly as possible because we need to get that job. And so if we frame the problem that we're talented individuals, and this is just one of many opportunities and one of many different directions we can go, I think we could slow that expediency down.
Right.
Now, on the other side, some people do need it. They need that expediency because they're just ultimately, they just don't have that implicit motivation that a lot of people, or some of us, have. And so I see how this set of institutions and set of norms is an important part to drive us forward. But I think for myself, I have to push on the opposite direction and say, I need to do things as best as I can and not worry about the expediency of everything.
Right. And I think that the framework, when it's taken too far, and this is where the house of cards comes in, it creates a situation where it's a bit of a game. It's almost like there's a strategy to to winning the game, but it's not really, the end is not so genuine. And I think
I,
for many of us, and certainly myself, we I would say for me, I didn't realize it as I was going through it, quite how much of a game it is until later, you know. And part of the game is, if a researcher, and certainly in my area, if a researcher if a researcher can gather and is very strategic at networking and getting funding and getting many people to work for them, you see, and also being very strategic about the type of research. Some research will be quite mundane, but it may garner a very high impact, sort of, citations and things like that. So there's a very strategic game to be played. And I think at some point that, a person has to make a personal decision as to whether they want to be part of that, or not, or to what extent. Yeah.
and I love that terminology that you're saying, because that's literally what a lot of people view it as like, it's a game to win. But then I ask, what are you winning?
Exactly. Do you even like the award, right?
Yeah.
Is it even really, what is it that, what is the bottom line? It is a question.
It's a game of that there's just more at the end of it, right? Like it doesn't end. It's
Right. I
not like
see what
you.
you're saying. I just, maybe I'll describe it a little bit, because there may be people watching who are not in academia, or maybe they're interested in academia, or they're earlier in their career. So what we're referring to is a system where people have to publish a lot, and preferably publish the type of research that others would cite. In other words, other people would need it or recognize it immediately. This is a very important point, immediately, because a real good and thoughtful research strategy is more long term for innovation. But here, what the system awards is a lot of publications at a higher impact. In other words, they have to have popularity, they have to be needed and cited by other people. And so, if someone were to enter that type of strategy, they would be more successful, maybe at getting a job, getting permanency, getting that tenure track professorship, getting acceptance by their peers. Um, and in order to achieve that, it isn't possible to sit on your own or with yourself and one other student, which is maybe a very good way to do research, but you can't achieve it like that because one person can, or two people, or even three, can't do the level of work and intensity that's required in given time, in the permitted time. So then the strategy and part of the game is to garner as many people to work for you as possible. And it's a type of machine. It's some kind of production that's going on. I have to say that. That's how I see it. And so this is what is rewarded within the system. The system is constructed to some degree to reward that. And what it does is producing a pressure to publish a lot and at high intensity and in certain areas to garner that recognition and high scores. There are scores as well, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
Thoughts on
everything
that?
is stored. Yeah, it's like if you were to imagine soccer or uh, I don't know, lacrosse or any game that's out there.
Nice,
Each
yeah.
player is ranked. Each team has a score that's associated with it. Um, it everything about it has a numeric value because I think at one point people had thought that this was a great way to sort of measure things. We need to quantify. And so a lot of the funding agencies and the institutions have quantified everything. Um, and I think like in the end, it is vastly successful. The institutions of science and research have been enormously successful in having impact on a broad scale. But then how do we connect to people that don't fit within that, or that feel misplaced, or that maybe they are highly successful, but they don't necessarily feel like they fit within that institution anymore, in the sense that it normally is sort of perceived. And I think what's wonderful, um, with new technology, digital technology, is that you can connect to people all around the world that we couldn't have done before, to tell those stories, to to do things that are atypical.
So I'd quite like to illustrate this with an example is that of the papers that I published, there's one in particular that is very highly cited. It's created this so-called high impact scoring. And it's a great paper. I wouldn't publish something that I didn't believe in. But at the same time, I have other papers that for the next 5 years have tremendous potential to create innovation. And those papers are far less, they've created less of a stir, they're less cited, but for the long term future, they have the research that I'm doing that comes off those papers, that is a continuance of those, has so much more innovative and discovery based potential. And so um, this is part of the illustration of the game and how it works. But if I would say, oh no, I'm going to cut that research out, I'm going to make myself successful so that I can get a tenure track, or achieve tenure eventually, I would go with that more mundane research that will create a stir and that will be cited by other people. And this is an unfortunate outcome of a system that, I'm not saying the system is entirely unsuccessful. Obviously, it has its benefits, and it does have its achievements, and yet um, that there are some serious problems, and people are starting to say that it is kind of broken. There is a brokenness to it. Yeah.
Yeah, so I would it's not that I don't think people are saying let's throw everything out.
No.
I think it's like, hey, let's just fine tune some of these things. I think we're sort of recognizing, and part of it comes down to recognizing humanity, which is a new thing for business as well. Like recognizing humanness in people is still hugely new. It's new in a family, right? If you think about how we understand families, I mean, my parents' generation, um, they were of they were parented like their kids were um, almost like laborers, right? They were not really parented the way that today, if I don't go to my kid's event, or, I'm not actively part of their life, I'm considered a bad parent. And that's this humanity, I think, and we're sort of reconciling, we're going through changes in norms in science that are lagging than what most of society are doing, but we're going through these changes where we're recognizing the humanness of people. Um, and it's uncomfortable for some because I think it's uprooting a lot of people that are highly invested in the previous infrastructure. Um, but I think we also need to recognize that there is a humanness, a human element to the scientific effort.
I think
Um,
it's a really important point that you're raising, and that humanness is a really important factor. It's important for individuals, for their own wellness and their well-being and their own sanity. But that humanness is not a weakness either. It's a tremendous strength. And actually, in some of your content, you speak of being empathic, and I think in some circles, and it may not just be academia, that is seen as some kind of weakness or foolishness. That's how I feel about it, but it isn't. Yeah.
yeah, so that took me so long, and I mean, my instant reaction is to feel like I'm not good. Um, but I've learned, and perhaps you feel the same way too, that I've learned that these weaknesses are just your individual traits. Um, and what we perceive as these sort of weaknesses are actually just a remarkable gift, right? Like even if you are sensitive, or um, that people make you cry, or that um, you get your feelings hurt easily, like all of those kind of things are just remarkable gifts of that you are able to sense other people,
Yeah.
and you can sense their intentions and what they're feeling, and that took me so many years, and I think is partly of me dealing with that, but also seeing how
Absolutely.
my kids deal with the world, that um, and then like I think about this, the research on what a good manager is is uniformly almost always talking about these soft skills, and we sort of have this view of leaders or managers as this historic, like Patton kind of person, right? General Patton, where they're sort of taking over the world and they're mean and they don't care about anything. But in fact, it's the complete opposite. It's the people that will stop and say, "Hey, are you doing okay? Can we have a conversation?" That actually are doing good leaders. And that's the things that and if I look up back in my life, the people that actually stopped and took time, that had a conversation with me and saw that, hey, my feelings were hurt, those were the ones that were having the biggest impact on my life.
It's true, and we know that the ability to perform, and I'm sure that includes academia too, is confidence. And another factor that comes in is amongst graduate students. Apparently, I'm not overly familiar with the data, but there are pretty high levels of depression and mental health issues, and there's certainly a problem there. Yeah.
So I've seen it. You feel it. Um, or I've seen some of the data. I haven't done my own unique research in that area, but and partly I can sort of sense it with this channel. The things that get a lot of traction are the ones that are tackling some of these harder problems, and a lot of it comes down to, I think we feel, and it's not just graduate students. I think it's uniformly everybody, in the scientific profession, that we're never living up to what we should. Um, and that we shouldn't show any weaknesses, whatever those things are, but remembering that we're very human, and often these weaknesses in almost every other context, it's an evolutionary program thing that makes us wonderful, right? Like those are the things that we wouldn't have those things
Yeah.
if we weren't if this wasn't part of our human nature from thousands and tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years of being programmed to be compassionate, being empathetic, being uh, taking the time to and sit at a campfire and talk to somebody. Um, I think ultimately those are really powerful things, and yet that is somehow seen as not a good thing in our career, and I can't reconcile why. I think um, I think we just need to recognize that we're all pretty freaking awesome and remarkable, um, and and just state it as a fact, right? Like these things that we think that we're just not good inside. It's the complete opposite. I think that we have astute abilities to see the world that other people can't see, and we're trained in that way. And so we see all of these sort of problems that the world has and we have, and ultimately we can see those.
Right.
Right, we can sense those, that is a unique and an amazing ability that not a lot of people have. um and I really think about that. I think about that a lot as, wait a minute, why are we so upset with ourselves with these things when in fact this is a gift that other people can't see and feel.
Being attuned to other people, it has aside from being a value in its own right, being empathetic, being kind spirited, being a decent person, that just has value in its own right. But aside from that, it can help you to know who to trust, who to collaborate with, who to keep a bit of a distance from, right? It has some very practical ramifications. It can also help you to uplift other people around you, changing the environment for the better in very subtle ways. These things are not to be, underestimated or undermined or devalued.
Yeah, and the irony is that they're not valued, right? That's the
Right.
irony, and I think that's where we can make a very positive impact by trying to do those things,
Right.
right? And just doing them regardless of whether they're valued or not, but knowing that that's actually a good thing to be a person that will stick their neck out, or have a conversation. So
So, in some of your content, you talk about not caring anymore about grants, applying for grants, and perhaps you hint to stepping away from some of the other norms or distancing yourself. Please speak a bit more about that.
yeah, so that is it's such an important part of my life where I have become less caring. And I know that seems like it's so counterintuitive, and I know that seems like it's not, um, I'm being a bad academic, but the rejection rate of the things that we do are 90%, probably even closer to 100% at some places.
It's 1 in 10
Um,
roughly success rate for many grants. Obviously, there are a spectrum of different grants, but that's more like a lottery win than anything like a
it is.
win. Yeah.
So I think and all of the times that I've been successful, quote unquote successful, is that there's been underlying things that have happened that are outside of my control. So things that, you know, for grants, for example, sort of hit the right tone at the right time. You know, it was
Right.
somebody picked up on something, you know, it was just like completely outside of my control. And the only thing that I can control is the number of times I try, number of times I get up, but then also the times of not letting any of that stuff, the negative, the so if I hit one, but there's 9 other times that get rejected, I'm very wedded to that because I spend so much time and effort. So the less I care about getting the one and the 99 other times, the more that I can get back up and just keep repeating, um, and hopefully find something.
Makes a lot of sense, but it's a tremendous amount of effort for relatively little reward, and that's difficult.
Absolutely. Um,
A lot of human energy,
so,
time.
but then that comes down to winning the race again, right? Like it comes down to you thinking that there is some sort of race. But if we just think about this as, let's just focus on the enjoyment of doing the work, of just being able to do this, to look, you know, I'm on this side of the ground. Um, that that is a wonderful thing.
Enjoying the process,
Um,
right?
right? I think it's a wonderful thing that we get to get up and to do things that are just exploring. So when my kids were little, um, And I think I've used this analogy a few times. My kids were little. We would stop at like mud puddles when they're like 3 or 4 years old and just look at mud puddles. Just look. And I want to replicate that. I think that feeling of just looking and exploring, and let's play with this puddle a little longer. Maybe it takes a little longer today,
Understand.
but that's where you're like, if you think about it, when you were 3 or 4 years old, you did not care about that you had to go, that there was this deadline, or
Yeah.
that there was all these constraints around you, but you just sat and pondered and looked at a mud puddle. And I think that's the non-caring part of things. I think that's what it comes down to, is realizing that there's a lot of beauty. There's a lot of amazing things in this world. And if we're so focused on just checkboxing things along the way, then we miss out on all of that beauty. And we miss out on all of those incredible things. And do I think it was a waste of time? Was I sitting there looking at my watch when my kids were looking at a mud puddle? Absolutely. But those were also the best moments of my time, and best moments of when my kids were growing up, when we took that time to look at a mud puddle.
Well, that's a great way of looking at the grant writing and proposal process. Just to let it
Yeah, we're
be.
just we're looking at mud puddles.
Nice.
You are. I mean, like this, yeah. We're. What else? What else is there to do other than just to keep looking at mud puddles and focusing on? Do we really need the huge infrastructure behind us to do a better job of looking at mud puddles? Probably not. We probably can still, even today, we could do some really cool discovery if we just look at it. Um, and I think coming back to that more innocent view of forgetting about that infrastructure allows us to get back up and do it again.
I understand. And when it comes to publishing in journals, you talk a little bit about that as well, and how you mentioned one paper in particular that you've tried to publish. Please expand on that.
Yeah, it just it's a couple of ideas just keep getting rejected, and I don't think people understand. If I just say it's just getting rejected, I think people don't understand the sort of enormity of this. This is stuff that you work for months and months and months on something, and you work on it, and you think it's a great idea. I think it's a great idea, but I am doing a poor job, I guess, of communicating, of thinking about these ideas, and often, but I let's hold that thought. So what ends up happening is you send these things in, and then people read it and they don't, they have their subjective opinion on what this means. And coming to terms with the fact that I used to process this as it was my fault. And I also think, like, it's not the fault of the reviewers, it's not the fault of the scientific, it's not the result of the editors, but it's a result of just not being at the right time in the right place and finding the right combination of both yourself and of who those other people are that are looking at that. And so there's a lot of chance, but the chance is it evolves so slowly that you take a lot, internalize it so much, and you process this so much, and you essentially just want to quit every time. But every time you get rejected. But I need to view, and I try to think about, what other contexts is this like? So one of them is like sales, or creating an entrepreneurial venture or something like that, where you just keep trying and you just keep getting rejected, right? You talk to 100 venture capitalists, or you go door to door and you've got a vacuum and you keep getting the door slammed in front of you. Well, what do? You just get back and do it again and find that right lucky shot that somebody is going to bring you in. And I know that the time scales we have are a lot longer, that they might be, instead of seeing 100 doors in a day, it might take you 10 years to see those 100 doors, but you
Right.
get back up and you just keep doing it.
That's part of the problem as well, is there is a bureaucracy, and that's with the grant cycles as well. When scientists or researchers apply for grants, the actual cycle of the grant to where you hear whether it was successful or not, and the same with publishing research in journals, they can be very long cycles. And so, yeah, you're right.
Yeah.
It takes people a long time. That's part of the problem. These cycles can take 9 months, to a year for the papers as well. And but to narrow down, the length of time, so that at least if whether a person is successful or not in a particular grant, that the cycle shouldn't take so long. That's part of the problem. Yeah.
So there is a natural, this is where I'm torn though, right? That there is a natural, it just takes time to do these things, right? To get feedback. It takes time to get feedback on it. Getting, and I don't know what is the right solution to it. I think we can use technology. That's partly why I'm doing the whole reciprocity project, is I think we can really, really speed things up or change things with technology. But at this moment, some of it, because I've been on the other side. I've been the reviewers, and it just takes time to get to it, or to read it takes a few days, right?
Definitely. So a bit about that as well. So, yeah, what's your experience as a reviewer?
So that's a good point. I try to be as specific as I possibly can, although I'm getting less specific but I try to. So as reviewers, the trouble is that most reviewers, they just simply tell you the problems, and then they don't help you figure out what to do next. And that is a really difficult problem because you don't see what they're seeing and thinking about. So from my perspective, what I try to do is I imagine somebody as like coaching them through that what they did was not wrong, but what they did can be shaped in a slightly different way, and to give them very specifics. And like, you just simply have to do these things and then it will be done, in terms of what I was expecting. And I think the problem lies when reviewers just kind of say, there's all these different problems and we don't know what to do. We don't know how to respond to that. I don't know what to do next often. So having some direction, I think, is super, super important with it. And I don't think reviewers really spend the time to give you direction in terms of what to do. They just throw up their hands. So having that is very, very helpful to get us um, to to know what to do next. Um,
Right.
so I think that's ultimately the key is we kind of bumble around not knowing what to do, or well intentioned, like not the reviewers, but the authors want to actually do that stuff, but they just don't know what to do because we're not given any insight in terms of what to do next.
So yeah, so also as a reviewer, I tend to take the perspective of how how can how can the authors make this successfully publishable, and then I outline those things as best I can. So the perspective is, what do they actually need to do to be able to publish it? And that's, that's generally the approach, rather than, oh, just, sort of brush it aside. And I had a quite an interesting experience recently with a particular paper I was reviewing. And I did that. I actually recommended changes, and I very carefully listed everything and wrote it out. And I recommended that it would be published subject to those changes. But ultimately, the paper was rejected, not because of my review. Okay. Um, it was one or more of the other reviewers. And in this particular instance, I was able to see what the other reviewers had written, okay, in their responses. And there was overlap. But I do feel that I was disappointed that the paper was rejected. I didn't think it needed to be rejected. It just needed to give the authors, it's like, let them publish their research, but
Yeah,
just tell them what it is that needs to be done. And in this case, I think it was very doable and relatively minor, and yet it was just rejected. I was actually quite disappointed at that. And it just
that
demonstrates.
happened. That happens about half the time with me
I
as
know.
a
It
reviewer.
happens in some journals. It could be 70 or 80% of the time. Depends. Their rate of acceptance can be quite low.
Yeah,
And I
and
just,
it's such a bizarre thing too, right? Because that rate of acceptance is artificial, right? We don't have these constraints anymore of what they used to in terms of publishing. Um, and it's such a weird artificial thing if it is. And I think the reason why we have these constraints is a social artifact now, that we have them because it demonstrates to other people that it's some elite outlet.
absolutely. I did feel that for some of the other reviewers, it may have been a competitive, sort of almost a little bit egotistical thing. There is an elitism that factors in. It is kind of, it really isn't about the research per se. It's about more than, it is about the research, but there are other factors that come into play. I'm wondering, do you think that it would help to have a double blind scenario? And I'm just going to explain what I mean by that. So for people watching, um, when researchers submit their research to be published in scientific journals, whatever the subject matter is, this gets reviewed by other people, by other scientists. And there could be one or more reviewers. Typically, it might be two or three. And you don't know, if you submit your research, you don't know who the reviewers are, but they know who you are. And I'm wondering if it might be better that it's called double blind. In other words, the reviewers don't know who the researcher is, and the researcher doesn't know who the reviewers are. And that brings a bit more objectivity into the game. Not
There
entirely,
is,
might help.
yeah. So I was just thinking about this. So our research articles in my field are single blinded, I guess, but apparently the reviewers don't know, but often you kind of know. but I was thinking about this notion of what that might look like, and an interesting problem. So who knows in our side, it's actually the editor knows both
They know both.
groups.
That's correct. Yeah. The editors
Um,
know both, but the thing is, it removes some of the bias, perhaps. Now the reviewers may be able to guess who the researcher is. It's usually very guessable, but it still removes some of the subjectivity and the bias, and also maybe introducing some other factors. I'm wondering if you've
yeah, I was just thinking. So the you had me thinking, and I don't know how doable this would be, but an alternative structure would be that the reviews are generated and then they're randomly, or they're given randomly to an editor that is blinded,
interesting, right?
right? So the editor doesn't see the paper, they just see the reviews. And then they have to make an assessment based on the reviews alone. I'm not sure if that would, or maybe two editors make
Right.
that
Two
that
editors making a sort of a decision. It's a very interesting kind of paradigm and process because it's supposed to be very objective, but it seems to be quite random, in my opinion, you know, at least to some degree. Um,
there's a lot of randomness,
yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um,
So, okay, so tell me a bit more about the reciprocity project.
oh, yeah. So it started as I wanted to. I went into my department chairs or to my department chair's office when I was about my second year of my PhD or of my assistant professor position, and I asked for copy editing or funds for copy editing. We didn't have funds at the time, or at least that was what I was told. And so I thought I teach. So my field is actually innovation, and I was teaching entrepreneurship at the time. I was like, well, damn it, I can make this. I could build this myself. So I tried to put a team together here um, in Tallahassee. That did not work. It just fell apart. And then I thought, okay, well, this is still a great idea. Let me get developers. So I got developers um, online, and then they built this thing and put it on the internet, and absolutely nothing happened. It was just crickets, right? I got like a couple of people on Facebook were like, "Yay, thumbs up." After spending all this money, I was very disappointed, very heartbroken. Um, and a friend suggested that I go onto YouTube and start talking about it. And so I started talking about it, and I got a little bit swindled at the beginning that, you just, there was people on YouTube that were saying you just simply have to, and, it'll explode if you do these kind of things. And one of them was like, you talk for 90 days straight. And so I did that every day. I put out a video every day, and I realized after some time that the things people were resonating with were more personal stories and more of dealing with my life, I guess. And then I started talking about those. I started being more open about those. And I realized as I've been doing this, and I've been increasingly more doing more challenging things and challenging conversations, is that there's a whole group of us that don't feel like we feel like we don't have a lot of hope. And I think I want to change that. And so I want to provide not only me shouting at my screen, um, you know, that you have a lot of potential and that you're an amazing, remarkable human beings. And part of that is trying to convince myself that. But then the other aspect of it is like, I could still, and with more help and with, just determination, we can make this thing some technical solutions that will make our life easier and hopefully solve some of these things or make it more fun. right? Like we have these old review systems. I don't know if you still have some of these. They're really old. They don't work really well. Like why can't we do something like a Duolingo or an Uber or something that makes are like fun, right? Like those things are fun to use, and we live in a time where we can do some of these technological solutions to make what we're doing enjoyable. And that's where I sort of situate. There's the one side of me shouting at my screen, like, "Hey, you're all right. You're doing okay." And then on the other side, which could because I think that there's a lot of people in this world that are they don't have maybe they're at a major research institution and they're in a bad culture, and there's lots of that. B, that they're not, or they're in a spot where they're kind of they don't feel connected. And so there's a whole group of people, and I would say it's probably the vast majority that are in that spot. And then on the other side, we have old infrastructure that doesn't seem, and nobody seems to be investing in it because there's no incentive to invest in making things fun and interesting because we're so focused on doing research that we get there's a spot where there's neglect. And I think I could be a lone voice or maybe many voices with you, right? Like the fact that you reached out to me, many voices of people changing the world just a little bit in a positive way.
Absolutely. And so do you see the Reciprocity Project as something that's sort of social, peer to peer, or is it more about, publish? What's the scope of
So the way that I think about this, and I've thought about this now, how to talk about it, is what if we had a system that created a non-rejectable research grant or a non-rejectable paper where at the end of it you do all these various different checks based on other people giving you feedback based on and it could be quick or it could be more intensive based on machines. We have some amazing tools now
yeah.
that gives us feedback along the way that at the end by the time you do this and maybe it takes just as long. Maybe it takes a month to checkbox all these things, but you have a paper or a research grant that is really, really well done. Um, that if you simply just follow this process at the end, you'd have something that, maybe the end goal would be that this would go into the reciprocity research journal, right? That they would choose to
I
go
was going to
into the
ask
research.
you, I'm glad you said it because okay, there's a couple of things. I'm going to backtrack a little bit. So
Okay.
first of all, when it comes to grant proposals and also papers, and especially the grants, it's quite sensitive. And what about the aspect of trust and who's reading my grant proposal before I submit it? Because, in my field and in many fields, you get scooped. You can get
Yeah.
scooped. It's a real
Yeah,
fact.
that is the hardest thing at this moment. I think that's what's holding it back. You get lots of people that sort of want to volunteer to help, and maybe that's what the problem is. But then on the other side, um, not a lot of people are submitting anything. In fact, like very few people submit anything on the platform, and I think that's part of the
I
problem.
think that might
So
be.
I did build in like sort of trust things, like there is a contract and rating systems, and those don't seem to be good enough at this moment.
See, I think, Dave, if I
Um,
submit my paper or grant proposal to somebody to look at, it's such a strong idea, but I would want to talk to them. I would want to build some trust with them.
yeah,
You see, before I did that, and so that's one factor. But then you brought up something that's very cool and very important because as part of the process, there is a random element. We've said this, and there is a need for more for more journals. And it seems like in your field there may be a need for more journals. So do you see because I could see how that platform, the way you've constructed it, and the systems that are already in there, it could quite easily translate into a journal where you bring in all these very positive ways of doing things, these new ways of doing things. Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think that is a long term. That would be very long term. I need to get the platform working, in the sense that people are using it. But that would be a long term vision. Would be that at the end, you could choose to submit it someplace else, or you can choose to submit it on on the platform, and that would be publicly available in some sort of new technology form, whatever it is. Maybe it's an NFT or, you know, any of these kind of things that they have. But I think so. This problem of trust is, it has not, it's not new. You know, we, if you think about Airbnb or Uber, you're bringing weirdos into your house in your car, and somehow we think it's okay. Right? Right? So why can't we do the same thing in a scientific field? Why are we so much more
yeah.
embedded in,
Let's talk about that model because
yeah,
okay, so in Uber, you know, the driver and the passenger are traceable and
yeah,
answerable.
yeah.
That's why I
The
get into
goal would be,
Uber. I mean, you know, rather than some random person's car, is that they are traceable and they are answerable. So there is a system in place. Now, that would be an interesting thing to possibly
so
introduce.
there actually is on the reciprocity platform, there's like a community that you see, um, you know, that you do get a chance to communicate with them. It's just, I don't think the design is there yet. So I think having that trust is an important part, um, that you're suggesting, and feeling like these are real human beings that are there. Help is an important part of it. Um, and then as well, like, some we can substitute a whole bunch of work with machines now, um,
True.
that we don't necessarily need humans to do some of those things. So I'm, you know, building trust. I think it's been done before in things that are, seem really uncomfortable, but my design skills are, they need more improvement. And so if there's designers out there that want to help, and they have to be doing it because they're heart, because they can't afford anything, um, you know, they can participate if they want to in changing the world a little bit.
Right. And just, you know, for the idea of a journal, I think at the moment, these, you know, journals, including relatively new ones, and again, I talk for the biological sciences, are extremely successful, even the new ones. And they seem to be generating very, you know, good yields, good incomes, because it's something that is so needed.
Yeah.
It's so needed. There's a lack of journals. Again, it's all these, you know, rejections. Some of the journals have an 80% rejection rate. So
Yeah.
there's a great need for more journals, and particularly a journal that would function in a way that is helpful to the researchers, that is more constructive, where perhaps um, the reviewers are instructed that they're going to accept the paper, but they have to outline what it is that will bring about acceptance of the paper.
Oh, that's actually a really cool way to think about it, right? That you're forced to accept it, but they have to meet these sort of standards.
Right. And it could be that they will outline quite expansive things that need to be done. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, it's a different approach. It's a different, yeah, and I think the need for a journal and for more journals that act this way, that function in a different way, is huge. And they seem to be making a lot of money with these APC, article processing charges. So, and the other thing is that the platform doesn't need to be used in order to be successful as a journal, because once you launch it potentially as a journal, it would need to be marketed. But again, it doesn't need existing use in that sense. So that those are just some ideas.
That's cool. Yeah, that's very cool. I was thinking about it in the back of my head, but that's I was thinking even now, what's strange is that people are using these preprint servers as a way to, like, it garners national attention now of things getting into preprint servers, and they're not even vetted, or international attention. So, that shows that there is a need for
There's
this.
that's right, and there's a drive. In other words, if some random reviewers or an editor doesn't understand the work that somebody is submitting, but the person knows it's genuine, knows it's real, knows that it's positive, they may just say, okay, let me just post it on one of these preprint servers, and as you say, it's gonna bring about the attention in another way.
Hmm.
And in a sense, that sort of democratizes the system a bit more. But there is a huge need. Papers are getting randomly, I think, I've seen it myself, randomly rejected, which means there's a need for something to take its place, in a sense, to you know,
To make it fun. I mean, ultimately, I think that's what.
make it doable. Don't, as opposed to let people publish their work. If their work is real, is positive, let them publish it.
Yeah.
Problem. you know
Yeah. Absolutely.
there's real reason not to, but I think that's the approach can be a more positive approach,
I actually
right?
probably should get going here. I can.
Okay.
Um, I don't want to keep you too much longer. Can I just say bye, everybody?